So, Neil, to what extent is English orthography a representation of spoken language?
This is the one I imagine maybe Chris and I might disagree with. I'm not sure. Be interesting to see where this one goes. So the real answer is that it depends, because Chris said it is literally a social construct of how you want to go about organizing these principles of how to make this incredibly complex language that we have and the writing systems that we use to represent it transparent for children that are learning it. Many phonics schemes have their own way of trying to, and that's effectively what phonics is. And I'm sure Chris will hopefully agree with this part, is that phonics is just how do we represent this English language in a way that doesn't overwhelm children when they first start to read. And so obviously most phonics programs, if not all phonics programs that I'm certainly aware of, they kind of try to hide some of this orthographic depth by creating a false code where literally we pretend that there is this kind of one-to-one correspondence. And so obviously in that state, then at that point, English orthography mirrors exactly what spoken language is. And as that kind of, we introduce that complexity where we start to have things where the same spelling has different sounds, or where different sounds can have the same spelling, then that's where I certainly thought, well, there's a nice, easy explanation for this. We can just say, well, letters are represented, sounds can be spelled with either, one letter, two letters, three letters, or four letters, and just kind of through a lot of practice, we can then sort of orthographically map, and we can use a bit of context when we're reading it to understand what this word might mean in this particular sentence. That tells us what, so if we're seeing, I had cheese on my bread, we know that the EA is the air and not one of the other representations that it could be. However, the more I kind of talk with Chris and various other people who are far more expert than I, there are certainly some sort of complications within that, in part because of the etymology of some of the words that we have. So what we mean by etymology is the history of that word and where that word has come from. So many, nice easy one, knight is in like a knight in shining armor, used to be in Middle English, I think, might be in Old English, knicht. And so the K sound was, very adamant and there at the beginning. Over time, language has evolved, because language, although say totally, a social construct, seems to have some sort of biological element to it, in that it does evolve over time and grows. You could put, I think on a podcast I listened to, it's about 1,000 years worth of difference between someone being able to understand the same language. So someone who was here in the year 1000 wouldn't necessarily be able to understand what we're saying right now, because it just sounds so differently, because language evolves over time as weird and wonderful things happen. And I'm sure we'll go into a bit more depth on that later on. So the argument is then, well, right now we don't we don't pronounce the K in night. So actually, are we happy with just telling children that, well, we can just say that here it's two letters, this K and the N, now spell this one sound of N, move on? Or actually, is it the right thing actually to say, well, actually, this is what I think it's called like an etymological marker, where it's telling us that at one point this was pronounced as KN and Knicht. It's the I sounds changed ever so slightly because of the great vowel shift. And whether that's something worth teaching about. Now, I'm not, for some words, I think I am, but I think for some words like knight and gnome, gnat, I think I think I'm quite happy with just saying, two letters, one sound. It used to be sounded out, now we don't. But for me, kind of this false representation that we provide students, I think is absolutely fine. And really, it's a nice thing. The teachers might know that the K was pronounced, the G in gnat used to be pronounced. Some teachers don't. Does it prevent children from actually developing and moving on with their spelling? not sure that it does massively. And so I think this is where Chris and I might disagree slightly on some things. I'm not sure.
The few things you mentioned there, because obviously I'm thinking 1,000 years ago, Normans hadn't yet invaded England or the British Isles. And on last week's Teaching Together podcast, I was talking to Dave Taylor about numbers to 20. And obviously, the numbers between 11 and 20 are impacted slightly by a little bit of what you were talking about there. And I was also talking about how over time vowels stretch or they contract, and that possibly happened with things like 13. Do you think the printing press has had an impact and it will slow the rate at which this is happening down? And so in 3023, do you reckon we'll still have a closer version of English? Because I think if you look at Scottish and Irvine Welsh, it's English, but it's not really. And I think if we, what do you think?
Two things. Yes, I think it probably will slow it down, although certainly, since the printing press in the 13th, 14th century, I think around that time.
In terms of English printing press, a lot was brought into Britain by Caxton in the late 1400s.
So evidently, since then you've had like Shakespeare plays, and obviously Shakespeare plays, we can read Shakespeare plays. We might be able to make pretty good educated guesses if you're literate, but they were printed in large-ish numbers, as well as, Samuel Johnson's dictionary was printed at one point. It was the most popular book in the world, but still language has evolved. So will it slow it down? Yes, I think obviously because far more is printed, not only, literally, but also kind of through social media and the internet and the World Wide Web, it will slow it down. But a lot of the reason why we, going back to that second question we had, why is English orthography as deep as it is? One of the many reasons is because of the printing press and decisions that were made by people who ran the printing houses at the time, purely because for various reasons. One, because they themselves were of Danish descent, and so they changed a few things around to some practical things like, we can't fit this spelling within the space that we have, so let's chuck something out. And then obviously various books with different spellings didn't survive, insert whatever invasion fire events, and so those were the ones that did. And I'd say because of over time we've ended up with the system that we have got. So yes, it will slow it down, I think, but it's also a pretty large reason as to why why we have the orthographic system that we currently have right now.
Yeah, sorry for the diversion, but that could be a podcast series on its own, let alone an episode. I'd listen to that in its entirety. So Chris, back to business. To what extent is it a representation of spoken language? And Neil's added this element of tension into what's going on, what the answer is going to be. I'm excited.
Well, first thing to know, before I dive into the question, I'm sure Neil is going to want to recommend a podcast on that very topic there, one that he recommended to me that I am working my way through very slowly, but it's very good indeed. What's it called again, Neil? The one on English etymology, can you remember?
It's just called literally The History of English podcast. Fantastic. I really recommend those first. It can get very, very niche into some particular parts of it, but I just love those first, because I'm obviously a massive fan of history. I just love those first 15 episodes where we just before we even get to English, where we think about Chris mentioned this idea of Proto-Indo-European. It's one of those first Indo-European languages. They think, and I think I recommended the book that a lot of that research comes from, The Horse. I'll get the proper name and put that in properly in a minute. So the idea being that language first of all started around in the Ural Mountains, so modern day Ukraine, and it was basically because of the domestication of the horse and genetic mutation that meant that people became lactose tolerant again, kind of after those initial stages of infancy, that allowed people to travel, and so obviously with travel becomes trade with different people, etc., and just kind of how then these languages then evolved over time. And so effectively there are many languages separated by literal time and space. So the two obvious one, you have Latin and Greek, which you kind of understand would be very similar. The Rome eventually overcame ancient Greece, and kind of so there was a lot of assimilation there of various sounds and alphabetic symbols. But also then you have this idea like that Sanskrit, which is like a language usually found in like India, like has quite a lot of cognates, has like lots of cognates to these languages as well. And so eventually, linguists kind of trace this idea that, Hellenistic, these kind of Latin Romance languages, all kind of stem from this one language of Indo-European. I just find it, as a history nerd, totally fascinating how that happened. So yeah, fully record. The whole thing is great. I'm still working my way through it. He's still bringing stuff out, but yeah, it's the kind of podcast that I can't do it on a walk because I just want to like stop and like write notes like about it all. But yeah, I really enjoy it, as you might have guessed. And in fact, if you came to my Let's Talk About Spelling talk, which I did about on a couple of research days ago, like the first maybe third of that podcast just literally takes us through, how English orthography got to the state that it was in. So no doubt I'll be talking a little bit about that, but not the whole thing later on. Otherwise, as I say, we'll be here for 40 minutes.
Yeah, just to say quite how niche that gets. There's a good episode which is purely about the location of Proto-Indo-European that Neil describes is identified through historical sources, through things like the fact that Proto-Indo-European seems to have a word that means honey, for example. So that must be an area of the world that has honeybees and this sort of, fascinating stuff. Back to the topic that we were talking about specifically with this question is like, to what extent is English orthography a representation of spoken language? Well, there's a larger question here, which is putting aside phonology, kind of the study of sounds, just for a moment. Like, you could make an argument that, well, that the purpose of written language is purely to take a spoken language and to have it in a written form, to be able to say, look, I can point at this and I can work out what that would be in speech. And that's largely the case. But because of the nature of a writing system, because of the fact that it exists and it becomes a tool in and of itself, as we can see by the fact that we can read fluently in silence more than we can out loud in a lot of cases, because it's this tool, it ends up taking on and doing things that speech can't do. It has affordances that speech doesn't have. So an orthography, or part of an orthography, might be the way in which we underline things and have subheadings. Now, you could make an argument that that's just representing the stress that we might say, that we might put into our voice. But that's probably not the case with subheadings, really. We're doing something slightly different. Or the use of paragraphs. Is that just, that represents a longer pause between two? You could argue that, but I personally make the argument that it goes beyond. Written language has affordances that spoken language doesn't have. So there are certain things that we can do with written language that we can't do with spoken language. So that's the first kind of larger question. Is it a representation of spoken language? Well, largely, but there are certain affordances that it has that means it diverges in certain ways. The second question that's kind of within that, which is, I think, largely what Neil was speaking to, and on which I largely agree, is the question of, well, to what extent is our written language representing the sounds of spoken language? And it's absolutely the case in English that largely what our writing system is doing, or a big component of what our writing system is it's taking those sounds that I mentioned earlier, phonemes, these kind of building blocks, these smallest building blocks of spoken language, and representing them using symbols. That's absolutely at the heart of our writing system. The question then is that all it's doing? And again, as I'm sure Neil agrees, it isn't. There are other things that our writing system is doing. There is morphology embedded into our writing system. And what I mean by that is that there are chunks of meaning that tend to be consistently spelled in our writing system, tend to be, not always, but tend to be consistently spelled, even when they represent they represent different sounds. So, for example, if we look at a word like nature and natural, you'll recognize, of course, they have the same underlying meaning behind those first three letters, but we pronounce one nate and one nat. even something as common as like the past tense. We say hinted. We don't say like helped. We say helped. We pronounce that kind of morpheme on the end, this chunk of meaning that shows the past tense in a slightly different way. And that's because our writing system isn't just representing sound, it's also representing meaning. So in answer to kind of the general question, to what extent is writing representing spoken language? Almost entirely that's what it's doing, but there are affordances that mean it can do other things. To what extent is it representing spoken sound? That's a big part of what it does, but it does more than that. And actually, that's as Neil suggested, that's kind of one of the reasons why we end up with this deep orthography, because it isn't just representing spoken sound. Neil mentioned the word night, which, yeah, I think is a really great example of this question. And we'll talk presumably a bit about phonics later. With a word like night, presumably, well, previously pronounced something like knicht, we see this idea that phonics and making these connections is something of a best fit. English orthography is really complicated. And in most cases, the relationship between letters and sounds is pretty unambiguous. No one's going to disagree with the idea that in the word, I don't know, shop, that the S and the H are representing sh, etc. But in a word like night, it's sensible to kind of simplify things, as Neil suggests, and as phonics programs do, and say, well, like the IGH, that's just representing the I sound, as we see in light and sight and might, etc. But that is a simplification of what's going on. The GH is, or at least can be argued to be a marker of a sound that's no longer pronounced. We could argue that that now means that the IGH is just working together to represent the I sound, and that's a legitimate way to look at things. But we have to recognize that our spelling system and the connection to the sounds of our language is a best fit approach, and sometimes it's just a bit of a muddle, like a word like Wednesday. Like, we could say that the D, N, and E in the middle of that is representing the sound but it isn't really. That's just a word in which the relationship between letters and sounds is a bit of a mess. But that doesn't take away from the general point, which is that at the heart of our writing system is connections between the sounds of our language, or the smallest sounds of our language, phonemes, and the letters that represent them.
Just come back on that. I think Wednesday is a word where absolutely, I think it makes total sense to go down the etymological route there and be like, when the Vikings came, which I know, Kieran, is your favorite topic of history, they had this god called Woden, and they decided to call this day Woden's Day. And so you can clearly hear Woden, and then through, sibilation, most likely, it became wed. We changed the woe to where, and obviously that D, then we kind of lost that as well, probably because, it takes effort. And so as humans, we tend to try to, if we can, in kind of spoken language, if we can try to take some shortcuts, like naturally we will do. And that's one of the ways that languages kind of like do evolve. We just become lazy, really, which says a lot for us as a species. Absolutely, I totally agree. Why would we tell them that DNE is N? It's far more interesting, I think, and makes more sense in that rare case where there is literally, it's the only one I can think of where we might, say DNE is particularly, this N sound. So yeah, fully on board with that part. I think particularly early on, though, you want to be as restrained with that to avoid any, too much complexity too quickly. So it's a lovely one for maybe like year 3. Would I go maybe year 2? Would I, have the children down at year 1 and say, right, children, today we're going to learn how to spell Wednesday, and it comes from this, the Viking god named Woden's Day? Probably not. And I think that's where, theory is all nice, but then you've got to think about, what this looks like in classroom practice as well. And that's a big part, I think, of what we as a podcast can offer.